team. My friend Andy Staples joins us now from The Athletic. Andy, how you doing, man? It's been quite a few days in the college football world, and some stuff that I don't know if you were expecting it or not. How have you been taking the news that the sport is undergoing a massive change?
Well, it just means business is good for me. I mean, there's a lot to write about. I don't know if I'd want to be one of those remaining Big 12 schools or one of the American schools who might get left behind if they backfill from the American, or one of those remaining Big 12 schools who might get left behind if the American is the aggressor first. And hey, there's a lot of stuff that could happen now. And I honestly, I mean, a week ago, if you'd have told me that Texas and Oklahoma were going to the SEC, I'd say you're nuts. Because not so much Oklahoma, but the attitude among Texas people was always, well, we're too good for that. We're not going to sully ourselves by thinking about playing the SEC. If you even brought it up to them, they'd, kind of fan themselves and say, well, I never faint. And clearly that has changed over the last few years. That attitude is gone. And now you have them willing to fold the Longhorn Network into the SEC network. And I mean, this is a different world.
One thing I always talk about when it comes to, I'm just going a different path here, but when Dabo, why would he go to Alabama? His path to the playoff is so easy at Clemson. He has it made there. So I ask you this question. The money is the obvious answer. Is it just money? Because the path to the playoff is a lot more difficult for the SEC if you're Oklahoma or Texas. Not
really. There's 6 at-larges in the new playoff.
Oh, if we're talking about the new playoff, sure.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's what we're moving towards. So, in fact, that might be happening by the time they get there. So it doesn't really change that much for them as long as the new playoff is coming. And, oh, by the way, the guy who runs their new league also helped design the new playoff. Of course, so did the guy who runs their old league. But for them, it is about money, and it's also about being in the strongest conference that you can be in. They are the strength of the Big 12. The rest of the Big 12 is kind of nothing without them. So that's not a great place to be in if you're worried there's going to be further consolidation. So if you think that 20 years down the road things will have consolidated more, then you may as well get in the strongest place you can get right now.
When you look at that, you mentioned, they could be in there by the time the new playoff starts. How quickly is this all going to come together? I can't imagine they're going to stay in the Big 12 until 2025.
It's hard to imagine. And now, if I were the 8 remaining in the Big 12, I'd do everything I could to keep them there and force them to stay, because that's $38 million a school versus whatever the new normal will be for those schools, which is 15 maybe. Somewhere between 10 and 15. So I would try to keep them as long as I could. But my guess is they will be so sick of one another after a year or so that there's probably a settlement to be worked out at a certain point where Texas and Oklahoma write a check and just move on.
Could that be as early as next football season?
I think to get them there by next football season, you would need the rest of the Big 12 to fall apart and everybody need to move, so they just say, oh, don't worry about the grant of rights. That would probably be the way you get in there by next football season, or one of the army of lawyers that Texas and Oklahoma employs find some loophole in that grant of rights that lets them out. But I think if you're doing a settlement, you're probably talking 2023.
Yeah, you said it's a good time for you in the content business. It's always a good time to be a lawyer whenever stuff like this is happening around the country. A lot of talk today that, this is just sort of a first step, not only for other conferences, but for the SEC. I've seen, I love Reddit, but I don't know how reliable it is. But this is the first step towards a 20 to 24 team SEC that they might try to pluck a team or two out of the Big Ten or anything like that. What's the next step of realignment we're going to have to go through? And then what is the next step for the SEC?
Well, it kind of depends on what everybody does now. Because I wrote a thing today saying the Big Ten needs to take half of the Pac-12, which would help shore the sport up as a national proposition. Because right now, if the Pac-12 stays as it is, because there's really nothing they can add that brings enough value to justify it, and then if they just stay at 12 and nobody touches them, they just get isolated over there, and they don't really factor into the national conversation. If they were part of the Big Ten, or their best schools were part of the Big Ten, then you do have West Coast schools that are part of the national conversation. And I think that would help, because the Big Ten right now is the only league that can compete with the SEC in terms of money and eyeballs and everything else. So that's your best shot, is a strong Big Ten gives you a real legitimate competitor to the SEC. The big question with all this is, what happens with the ACC? Because they have a TV contract that runs till 2036. They have a grant of rights, meaning all their TV rights are tied up. So what that means is the school has said, the conference has my rights, can sell the rights to my home football games, home sporting events, through this date. So theoretically, they're completely tied together till 2036. But if for some reason that grant of rights didn't hold up, I think it's pretty interesting. Then what does the SEC? Let's say Clemson and Florida State wanted to join. Will the SEC turn them down? I don't know that they would, because they could just create kind of a super league in football. And we're thinking in this in traditional terms. Everything is changing right now. You have NIL, you have the transfer rules changing, you have the Supreme Court ruling, the NCAA, you have the president of the NCAA saying basically individual sport governing bodies should pop up. So what if all of a sudden a bunch of schools decide we're creating our own football league? What if they all happen to belong to the SEC right now? And they say, we'd like to get Ohio State and Michigan State and Penn State and Clemson and Virginia Tech to join us. Well, I don't think that's something that happened right now. But is that something that could happen in 10, 15 years? Yeah.
So that sort of leads into the next thought. And you mentioned the NCAA. In 10 years, is there still an NCAA as we know it today?
Not as we know it today. I mean, all the rules basically, the Supreme Court ruling basically told them you need to rewrite your rules and change your model. And so they've got to figure out how to do that. And the schools have to figure out what they want to do with that. And the best way to do that might be individual sport governing bodies. It might be easier that way. So we may see that there's a group running football, which, I mean, there's already a group in place that could run football, and that's the FBS conferences that run the college football playoff. But the question is, how many of those survive 10, 15 more years if they're going to consolidate like this?
What does this mean for Mississippi State and Ole Miss? Obviously, it's going to be a bigger paycheck, but is this good or bad, in your opinion, for the smaller schools in the conference?
Well, I keep having people say, oh, you need to worry if you're Vanderbilt or you're going to get cut loose if you're Indiana or something like that. I don't think that's necessarily true. The grandfathered in people still seem pretty safe to me, because I haven't seen a lot of evidence of schools or conferences just jettisoning schools. We saw Temple get kicked out of the Big East in 2004, and I think was it Idaho and New Mexico State got kicked out of the Sun Belt.
Yeah.
But you just don't see that very often. So I think it just means more money. Now, you're going to need to be competitive. I think being completely non-competitive is not helpful, but as long as you bring something to the conference, and both Mississippi State and Ole Miss have been competitive in football and ultra-competitive in football in the last 10 years. And then, Mississippi State just won the CWS. Vandy has won, 2 CWS titles since 2014? Mm-hmm. So they are still doing things that bring value to the conference. And I think as long as you do that, you're fine.
One last question before we get you out of here. And I saw this on your Twitter feed. We were talking about it in the previous segment. Free queso at the Mexican restaurants in Oklahoma. What is going on there?
It is the strangest thing. Blew my mind the first time I was in Norman, and went to the Mexican place that wound up becoming the favorite place of Baker Mayfield. And there's a place called Tarahumara's that every time I go to Norman, I end up going there. But it's not just them; it's everywhere. When they put they call it the setup on the table. It's basket of chips, which you get free everywhere. Right. Salsa, which you get free everywhere. But then here's what comes next. Queso, automatically. You don't have to ask for it. You're not getting charged for it. And a plate of fresh steaming tortillas that you do not have to ask for. It's unbelievable. And apparently the way it works in Metro OKC is if you open a Mexican restaurant and you try to charge for queso, you're going out of business.
Well, I'm all in favor of this. this edition, plus we already know about Texas barbecue. I mean, from a culinary standpoint, it's a better culture fit than I could have possibly imagined.
I love
Andy
this country.
It's incredible.
It's great. Andy Staples from The Athletic, man. Thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate the time today.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
You can't beat it.
That's what this country was built on. Free queso for everybody.
If you charge for queso in Oklahoma, you're going out of business.
That's capitalism at its finest, friends. We'll be back just a minute. We'll wrap up the 3 o'clock hour here on Sports Talk Mississippi.